The fossil had been there for 400 million years. Harriet Croft had been trying to extract it for 40 minutes, which she considered a reasonable ratio. She was crouched at the base of the old city wall on a Tuesday morning in October, her notebook open on a flat stone, her good coat acquiring limestone dust along the hem that would require explanation at dinner. The wall was Roman at its bones and medieval in its skin, and where the two met, time left evidence. Harriet collected evidence. She freed the ammonite, small, tight-coiled, perfect, held it up to the flat grey light, noted the diameter, sketched it in the margin with a notation about the stratum. Her publisher in Edinburgh was waiting, not patiently, for 12 finished illustrations. She had 11. This would be 12. She wrapped the fossil, tucked it into her basket and turned toward home. She was composing the caption in her head when she rounded the corner onto Stonegate and nearly walked directly into a man coming the other way. They stepped back. They looked at each other. He was tall, blonde, dressed with the kind of quiet expense that didn't need to announce itself. His coat fit the way coats fit when the tailor had been paid enough for 3 extra fittings. He had dark eyes that were, at present, cataloguing her. She found this mildly irritating. "Miss Croft," he said, not a question. "You have the advantage of me. Julian Mercer, Aldwick." She was aware the Duke of Aldwick existed. She was aware he was Freddie Mercer's older brother, reportedly intelligent, reportedly formidable, the sort of man whose good opinion people spent considerable effort pursuing. He was also currently standing in her way with limestone dust on his sleeve from where she'd nearly collided with him. "Were you looking for my father?" "I was." "Then I can take you." She walked. He fell into step beside her, adjusting his pace to hers without comment. She noted this without assigning it particular merit. It was simply the minimum. "My brother mentioned you were a naturalist," he said. "Did he?" "He mentioned several things." Harriet opened her front door. "Whatever Freddie mentioned," she said, "my father will be more useful to you than I am on the subject." The Duke stepped inside. Her father received him warmly and sent for Harriet within 10 minutes. She had been in the sitting room attending to her caption, and the uncomfortable awareness that she was attending to her caption while listening to the study wall. She was back in the doorway before her father finished the sentence. "Miss Croft?" Julian was standing by the window, one hand behind his back. "How you want to know about Clara Bramley?" she said. "Your father suggested you were acquainted." "I am. Thomas Bramley is my father's oldest trading partner. His daughter and I are well acquainted." She sat down. "What do you want to know?" "Whether the attachment is serious, on Miss Bramley's side." "It is?" Something moved across his face. "Then the situation is more complicated than Freddie suggested. The situation is that your brother has been calling on a young woman for a month. She has formed a genuine attachment, and he has either done the same, in which case you have a decision to make, or he has not, in which case you have a worse one." The Duke looked at her. "You have a very direct manner," he said. "You asked a direct question. Most people don't speak to me quite so plainly. Most people are hoping you'll do something for them." A pause. "I am not." Her father made a small sound from behind his desk that could have been a cough. "Your opinion of the match," Julian said, "if it were to proceed. Clara Bramley is sensible, warm and considerably more intelligent than her circumstances have required. Whether she is suitable by your family's measure, I cannot say. Whether she deserves to be handled gently, regardless of outcome, is not a question at all." He was quiet. "No," he said, "I suppose it is not." He came back the following morning, and the morning after that. The stated purpose varied. Her father was always the first destination. She was always sent for within 10 minutes. By the third visit, Harriet stopped pretending to be surprised. "Your Grace." "Miss Croft." He produced a folded paper from his coat. "I need to understand York society as it relates to the Bramley family's standing." She looked at the list. At the top in his precise hand, "Who matters and why?" "You may call it what you like," she said. "In York, who matters is complicated by the fact that this city has been mattering to itself since the Romans. You, for example, are a newcomer. I am a duke. You are a duke from the south who has been here 11 days. The Bramleys have been on Petergate for 40 years. She tapped the list. "This will require more than a morning." "I have more than a morning." She looked at him steadily. He was sitting in the slightly too upright chair across from her, occupying it as though it were a throne. Habit, she suspected, more than intention. "Your brother," she said. "What does he actually want?" "This week, he wants to take Miss Bramley to the concert at the Assembly Rooms on Friday." "That is a perfectly respectable idea." "I know." You don't look pleased. I'm cautious. Caution is appropriate. Severance is not. She held his gaze. That's what you came to York to accomplish, isn't it? A clean exit. He didn't answer. Your Grace, she said, I will not help you engineer a quiet removal. I will help you navigate this honestly if that's a version you're willing to consider. You are remarkably confident for someone who has known me 4 days. I was confident before I met you. Meeting you hasn't changed it. The almost amusement, they're gone. No, he said, I can see that. He folded the paper back into his pocket. The assembly room's Friday. Will your family attend? We generally do. Then I will see you there. He left. Harriet opened her notebook and wrote in the margin beside the ammonite sketch, harder to read than limestone, probably less honest. She considered it, then crossed out, probably. The assembly rooms on Friday were full in the way York's assembly rooms were always full in October. Summer visitors gone, permanent residents reasserting dominance, music decent and gossip better. Louisa on the way in said he was extremely handsome. Their mother said he was a duke, which covered both the confirmation and the warning. Harriet said he was present and nodded across the room. Julian stood with Freddie at his shoulder, talking to local gentlemen with the polite attention of a man who had mastered social performance and found it wholly unremarkable. Freddie spotted her first, grinned, and came over with the confidence of someone who had not yet understood the gravity of his situation. Freddie Mercer was 22 and looked it. Shorter than his brother, darker-haired with a face that defaulted to cheerful and meant it. He greeted her parents, told Louisa she looked splendid, and turned to Harriet with an expression that was equal parts affection and mild guilt. Miss Croft, Julian tells me you've been very helpful. Your brother tells you what suits him. Is Miss Bramley here? By the far window. He lowered his voice. I know what you must think. You don't, actually. What did you think about Clara? Freddie was quiet in a way she hadn't seen before. I think she is the best person I've met in York, he said. Possibly elsewhere. He paused. Julian would say that isn't the point. And you? I say it's rather the whole point. He looked at her. Do you think I'm being foolish? I think you're being young, said Harriet. That is a different thing. Freddie smiled. Then his brother arrived at his elbow. Julian in an assembly room was a different creature from Julian in her father's study. He moved with the ease of someone who had never once wondered whether he belonged somewhere. He greeted her parents, spoke briefly to Louisa, who went faintly pink, understandably, and ended up beside Harriet with the inexorability of tidal movement. Freddie looked well, he said. He did. She glanced at him. He told me she's the best person he's met in York. Julian said nothing. He also seemed resolved to continue regardless of inconvenience. I know. A pause. Freddie falls in love with someone unsuitable every 18 months. It usually resolves. Usually? Yes. And if it doesn't this time? He looked at her, composed, dry, faintly ironic, the expression of a man keeping people at a manageable distance. Then we'll have a more serious conversation. You'll need to have it with Thomas Bramley as well as your brother. I'm aware. Thomas Bramley is not impressed by titles. Neither, he said very dryly, are you? No, but I have fewer consequences. Across the room, Freddie stood beside Clara with his whole body angled toward her. She was laughing at something he'd said. He does care for her, Harriet said quietly. I know. A pause. That is what makes it difficult. The notebook became a problem on a Wednesday. Harriet had left it on the sitting-room table. The working notebook with margin notes, half-sketched observations, and several annotations that were less scientific than personal. She had gone to fetch her shawl. She was gone 8 minutes. When she came back, Julian was standing at the table with her notebook open in his hands. He did not look caught. He looked up and said, The stratigraphy notes on the 3rd page are wrong. Harriet stopped. The limestone you've marked as lower carboniferous. It isn't. The ammonite is oolite, the same formation as the Yorkshire coast. William Smith identified it 30 miles south of here not 6 years ago. She crossed the room and took the notebook from him. That notebook is private. It was on the table. In my house? Technically the sitting room. Do not be technical with me about this. He sat down in the upright chair. I wasn't reading your correspondence, I was reading your stratigraphy notes. You read whatever was open in front of you? Yes. And the limestone is oolite, not carboniferous. The lias beds below it are a different matter, but what you've marked on page 3 is oolite throughout. Harriet stood very still. How do you know that? My family's Yorkshire estate. The limestone formation is identical. I spent considerable time identifying it with the land agent after Smith published his survey. The coiling on your ammonite is characteristic. He paused. The illustration is very good. She looked at her own notes, looked at the sketch. He was right, she could see it now, the formation of the coil, the particular compression. She had been so focused on the extraction that she had not stepped back far enough to see the context. If it's oolite, the sequence on page 7 is also wrong. And the comparative note on the Whitby deposits needs reconsidering. Whitby's are the same series. The comparison would strengthen your argument considerably. She looked up. You know the Whitby deposits. I was there 2 summers ago. A brief pause. With a younger relative who was interested in fossils. You didn't find it interesting yourself. I found it more interesting than I expected. Harriet looked at him for a moment, reconsidered something. Then she turned to a clean page and began writing. He did not leave. She did not tell him to. 15 minutes passed in silence except for the scratch of her pen and once his quiet observation that the afternoon light from this window was better, which she knew and had already accounted for. When her father appeared in the doorway, Harriet said without looking up, "His Grace has been correcting my geology." "Has he?" said her father. "The limestone is oolite," said Julian, "not carboniferous." "Ah," said her father, "well, quite." The suitor arrived on Thursday. Geoffrey Ulford, second son of a Lincolnshire baronet, 30, pleasant, steady, thoroughly respectable. He had a good income and a modest interest in gardening. He called on her father with intentions that were transparent to everyone in the house within 4 minutes. Her mother was optimistic. Louisa was delighted in the way sisters were delighted by romantic possibility happening to someone else. Her father said nothing directly because he never did when events could develop themselves. Fulford was perfectly unobjectionable. This was, Harriet found, its own kind of problem. He asked about her work with the polite interest of a man who understood that women might have interests and felt it good form to acknowledge them. He did not ask follow-up questions. He did not disagree with anything. He called 3 times that week. She felt nothing when he walked into a room. She was thinking about this, about Alfred's perfectly adequate attributes, and the uncomfortable fact that arguing with Julian Mercer about geological strata made her feel, if nothing else, entirely alive. When Julian arrived on Friday morning, and she opened the door herself and found him on the step with an expression she hadn't seen before. "Freddie has done something," he said. She stood back. "Come in." What Freddie had done was propose. Not formally, no permission sought, no procedural gravity. He had proposed to Clara in the Bramley family's back parlour, with only Clara's younger sister as inadvertent witness. Clara had said yes. Freddie had gone home and told Julian at 11 o'clock at night with an expression of such complete happiness that Julian had been, to his own considerable irritation, unable to say what he'd intended to say. He was happy, Julian said. He was standing by the window, which was where he stood when something had actually landed on him. He has not been happy like that before, not that I have seen. "What will you do?" Harriet asked. "I need to speak to Thomas Bramley before this becomes public knowledge, and before Freddie tells another living soul, which, knowing Freddie, he already has." He turned from the window. "Will you come with me?" She blinked. "To speak to Bramley." "You know him. I do not. And I am—" The word seemed to cost him something. "I am trying to handle this the way you suggested. Honestly. I would find it useful to have beside me someone who won't defer to my title and tell me what I want to hear. I am almost certainly not going to tell you what you want to hear." "I know," he said. "That is why I'm asking." Thomas Bramley received them in his front room, broad, grey-haired, with the direct eyes of a man who had built a business on knowing when he was being managed. He looked at Julian for a long moment. "Your Grace, my daughter tells me nothing yet. I take it your brother was more forthcoming. He told me last night. I wanted to speak to you directly." Straightforward. Bramley's eyes moved to Harriet briefly. "Miss Croft," back to Julian. "So what are you thinking?" Julian was quiet for a moment, actually composing an answer rather than a performance. "I'm thinking my brother is 22 and has proposed to a woman he's known 6 weeks, and that I came to York to prevent precisely this, and have signally failed. I'm also thinking he was genuinely happy when he told me, and I'm not certain what weight to give that against everything else." A pause. "What I want is to understand what this would mean for your daughter, what she understands about the differences between them. Not to discourage it, to make certain that if it proceeds, it does so with clear eyes. And if I told you it proceeds regardless of your blessing, then I'd rather have been honest in advance." Bramley was quiet. Then, Clara knows what he is and what she isn't. She's not a fool. He looked steadily at Julian. Are you asking for time? I'm asking for honesty on all sides. Then you'd better have tea, said Bramley, and we'll talk properly. Harriet sat back in her chair and thought that Julian Mercer, when he was not performing his own boredom, was a considerably more interesting man than she had initially assigned him credit for. She did not write this in her notebook, but she thought it twice. They argued about Freddie for the better part of the following week, about reasonable timelines, about whether Bramley's agreement to extended courtship was progress or delay, about the difference between structure and honesty. Her father appeared in the doorway once and asked if anyone wanted tea, which they both accepted without interrupting the argument. In the spaces between, they talked. Julian knew Yorkshire, not its social machinery but its land, the way light moved over limestone country in October. He asked about her work and listened as though he were actually thinking about the answers rather than composing his response. He had opinions about books and expressed them without performance. He told her once that London dinner parties pained him, because people discussed books they hadn't finished in the language of people who had read nothing else. She said she avoided London dinner parties for precisely this reason. He looked at her sideways, which was, she was beginning to understand, his version of a smile. On Thursday he picked up her notebook again. She had her back to him. She heard the particular silence of someone picking something up and made a decision in 4 seconds to say nothing. She kept writing. He kept reading. After a few minutes, the Oolite correction is in the caption. I updated it Monday. The plate title isn't. I'm deciding between 2 phrasings. What are they? She turned around. He was holding the notebook with the comfortable air of someone who had been permitted this. She was not entirely certain when permission had been granted or whether she minded, and she crossed the room and pointed to her 2 penciled options. He looked at them. The first is more precise, the second reads better. I know, that's the problem. Scientific writing doesn't need to read well. Mine will, said Harriet, because women are only permitted in natural philosophy if they are not only correct but elegant, and I intend to be both. He was quiet for a moment. Use the second phrasing, he said. I'll read it to mean the first. That is a very strange compliment. It wasn't a compliment, it was a practical suggestion. I see. She sat down, wrote the second phrasing in ink. Thank you, she said, without looking up. He didn't leave for another hour. The notice in the York Current appeared on Monday. Not technically an announcement. The kind of paragraph printed when a piece of information was common knowledge and the printer had space to fill. A social note observing that a Mr. Frederick Mercer, brother to the Duke of Aldwick, had been seen in frequent attendance at the Bramley household on Petergate, and that local society awaited developments. By Tuesday morning, Clara had been visited by 3 neighbours and her mother's closest friend, ostensibly calling, actually assessing. By Tuesday evening, Julian arrived at the Croft house on foot without his hat at 6:20, not a calling hour. Harriet opened the door herself. One look at his face. Come in. Freddie told someone, he said in the study. I assumed. He told 3 people in the first 48 hours because he was happy and wanted to share it, and did not understand that happiness, in his position, is not a private matter. He stopped. The assembly rooms have a concert Thursday. Everyone will be there watching. Yes. What I do will determine whether this proceeds with dignity or becomes York's entertainment for the winter. You cannot handle it well if you're still hoping for a clean exit. She looked at him. Are you still hoping for that? A long pause. No, he said. After speaking to Bramley, I think Freddie may have chosen better than he knew. He looked at the desk. That doesn't mean I know what happens next. Nothing has to happen next tonight. Thursday is Thursday. He stood, picking up his hat. I find, he said with the tone of someone acknowledging something they'd rather not, that I rely rather more on your judgment than I intended to when I arrived in York. That seems to have surprised you. Somewhat. Does it concern you? He considered this honestly. Less than it probably should. He left. Harriet sat in the quiet study, then went upstairs and opened her notebook and did not write anything for 20 minutes before writing only, less than it probably should. She underlined it once. The assembly rooms on Thursday were precisely as expected. York society at its attentive worst, pleasant on the surface, calculating underneath, dressed in its best. Freddie and Clara arrived together, which was bold. Clara's mother flanked them, small and watchful. Freddie had his hand briefly at Clara's elbow as they came through the door, dropped it immediately, but the damage was done. 3 heads turned, 6 more followed. Julian arrived 20 minutes later and crossed the room without urgency, greeted acquaintances, and arrived at his brother's side in a manner suggesting he'd simply found himself there. He shook Clara's hand, spoke to her mother, gracious, warm, unreadable. Harriet watched from across the room and thought, he is very good at this, and then it must be exhausting. He found her gaze, held it for a moment, that particular look she'd come to recognize as his version of acknowledgement, then looked away. Mr. Alford appeared at her elbow. Harriet performed the appropriate warmth, attended to his conversation with the surface of her mind, danced one set with obedient pleasantness, and returned to the edge of the room. Julian was behind her. "Mr. Alford," he said, not to her, to the air. "He is a perfectly pleasant person," said Harriet. "Yes." A pause. "Freddie is about to ask Clara for the second dance," she said. Julian turned. Freddie was already moving through the crowd, with the specific trajectory of a man who had thought about this and done it anyway. "You're not going to stop him," she said. "No, he asked me this afternoon if I would object. I said I would not." A pause. It seemed the right answer. She looked at him. He was watching Freddie, and his expression was something she hadn't seen before. Not composure, not irony, but something simply present. She looked away before he turned back. The trouble started at 9:30. No particular source, just accumulation. Too many glances, too many whispered exchanges. The attention on Freddie and Clara had reached a kind of critical density. Then Mrs. Hartwell, a woman of 50, York's social authority in human form, crossed toward Clara's mother. Harriet was too far to hear the words, but she saw Clara's mother go very still. She saw Clara, 2 feet away, hear something, and watched her face go carefully blank in the manner of a person deciding very quickly not to feel anything in public. Harriet moved. Julian was already moving from the other side of the room. She reached Clara first. Clara's mother caught her eye immediately, a quick, controlled look, and said under the noise of the room, "Mrs. Hartwell was good enough to observe that merchant families have occasionally married above themselves before, and that it has seldom answered." She said it with perfect steadiness. She had clearly been preparing the sentence since the moment it happened. "How generous of her," said Harriet, "to share the historical record." She turned to Mrs. Hartwell, who had not yet retreated, and said something low and specific about the Hartwell family's present position in York's trading economy, which she knew well through her father, and which she deployed without pleasure but without hesitation. Mrs. Hartwell's expression shifted. She moved away. Julian arrived. He looked at Harriet. She looked at him. "What did she say?" he asked quietly. Harriet told him. His expression didn't change, but something in the set of him did. He turned to Clara, and his manner was unexpectedly warm. "Miss Bramley, I believe the next set is forming. Will you permit Freddie to embarrass himself on the floor? He dances with a great deal of enthusiasm and almost enough skill." Clara's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. What came through was relief. "He does dance rather enthusiastically. Aggressively, it's a known problem. We've discussed it. He is not improving." Clara almost smiled. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Thank Freddie," he said. "I am merely managing his consequences." Freddie led Clara to the floor. Julian watched them go. His expression, which had been genuinely warm, returned to its defaults. "He managed that well," said Harriet. "Freddie. He knew she needed something without asking for an explanation. He has no idea what was said." "No, but he stayed." She paused. "That is not nothing." "A moment, then. Your suitor is watching you from the east wall." Harriet did not look. "He is not my suitor. He calls 3 times a week. That does not make him my suitor. In York it rather does. In York I am told a great many things I don't accept as binding." She looked at him. "Why are you watching Mr. Alford?" "I wasn't. I noticed him." "There's a distinction." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "there is." Harriet said nothing. Her pulse did something she did not instruct it to do. She attended to the music instead. At 10:20, Freddie, emboldened by the successful evening, took Clara to the supper room. Clara's mother didn't see it happen. Julian didn't see it. Harriet did, and opened her mouth to say, "Freddie," and then didn't finish, because they were already gone. Julian noticed the empty space where his brother had been. "Supper room," said Harriet, "with Clara." His expression didn't change, but the line of him did. That was poorly timed. "Yes, but you cannot go after them publicly. It will be worse than letting it play out. They've been together all evening. It's already been remarked upon." "I know, let it be, they'll come back. It will be noted, talked about, and then it will be over, and they will be engaged. because that is where this has been going since the first Tuesday your brother stood outside Bramley's and introduced himself. The only question is whether it's treated as scandal or as something the family embraces before anyone else can frame it. Julian was very still. I am aware, he said, of where this has been going. Then you know what you have to do. Yes. A pause. I don't object to Miss Bramley. I want that to be clear. Then what? I object to having had no say, to Freddie doing whatever he pleased and expecting me to manage the consequences, which is what he has done since he was 14 and apparently intends to continue until one of us is dead. The edge was in his voice now, real and controlled and sharp. I came to York to handle a situation. Every step I took was toward a reasonable resolution. And Freddie has undone every single one of them because he wanted to dance twice and eat supper. That is not what happened tonight, she said carefully. No, sharp. Tonight your brother demonstrated a genuine attachment. Tonight you stepped in when Mrs. Hartwell was cruel. Tonight is not a disaster, Julian. It is simply not the version of events you planned. She had used his name. She was aware of it the instant it was out. So was he. The pause before he said, not unkindly but with precision, my name is generally reserved for those I've given leave to use it. Nobody was watching them. Nobody could have heard. Harriet felt the full weight of it. Not the words which were technically within his rights, but the choice to say them now, to her, when she had simply spoken without thinking. The first time she'd let her guard down in front of him. Her face went neutral. She had good control. You are quite right, she said. I beg your pardon. Miss Croft. I think Freddie and Miss Bramley have returned from supper. I hope the evening resolves to your satisfaction, Your Grace. She went to find her mother. She did not look back. She left her notebook on the sitting-room table. She didn't notice until she was upstairs, and then she noticed and did not go back down. She knew which pages were visible, the caption revision, the stratigraphy notes, and in the bottom right corner of page 12, very small, drawn 3 days ago when his voice had been in the room and her hand had been moving without her full permission, a sketch, a profile, blonde, slightly sideways, enough to be recognizable. She lay in the dark and thought not about the sketch but about what she had seen on his face before he deployed the corrective, the thing that had not been distance at all. She did not know he came back. Not to the house, to the street, past midnight. He stood on the pavement outside for some minutes he couldn't afterwards have counted. He hadn't knocked, hadn't intended to. He had walked back because what he'd said had been technically within his rights and substantially wrong, and he knew both things simultaneously, and the combination was unbearable. He returned to his rooms, sat in the chair by the window, thought about her face going neutral. He was not, he told himself, accustomed to feeling like this. He did not tell himself he was not accustomed to being wrong. He knew that one already. At 10:30 the next morning Julian arrived. Harriet heard him at the door, heard her father was out, heard him ask for Miss Croft. She was in the sitting room. She was holding the notebook. She had opened it to page 12. She was deciding something. He came to the doorway. He had his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and would not use the rehearsal. I said something last night that was wrong, he said. The manner of it, the timing. You were not managing me, you were simply speaking, and I said something precise that was designed to put distance between us at a moment when I did not actually want distance, which makes it worse, not better. He looked at her directly. I'm sorry. Harriet looked at him. The apology was real. The self-analysis was more honest than she'd expected. He'd come in person rather than by note. She was also perhaps already decided before he knocked. Sit down, she said. He sat in the upright chair. I accept your apology, and I used your name without leave, and that was a liberty I hadn't been given. I give it now, he said immediately, if you want it. She looked at him. Julian, she said, testing it. Harriet, he said quietly, specifically, nothing like the way anyone else said her name. Something shifted, not dramatically, no weather, no light change, but something in her ribs. Freddie, she said, because they needed for the moment to be about Freddie. Freddie, he agreed, and the ghost of something moved across his face, closer to amusement than she'd seen before. What do we do about Freddie? We help him, together, without a plan to end it. Together, he said. Is that acceptable? A moment, then, yes it is. She opened the notebook to the stratigraphy page, not page 12, and set it between them. They got to work. 3 days passed in the careful manner of days that know they are being watched. Harriet went about her work. She finished the ammonite caption, revised the plate title, wrote 2 letters to her Edinburgh publisher that were models of professional composure and contained not one word about geology or dukes. She took her sketchbook to the Minster on Wednesday morning and drew the nave columns for 20 minutes before realizing she had drawn the same column 4 times. Julian managed things. He spoke to Freddie. He spoke again to Bramley. He arranged for the extended courtship to have structure. Freddie would remain in York through December. There would be no formal engagement until January at the earliest. Both families would have time to adjust. It was sensible. It was reasonable. It was exactly the kind of plan that worked on paper. Freddie, told of this plan, said, "Yes, of course, absolutely," with the wholehearted agreeableness of a man who had already decided January was a formality. Julian reported this to Harriet on Thursday morning, and she said, "You know he's going to propose again before December." And Julian said, "I know." And they sat with this in the particular silence of 2 people who have arrived at the same conclusion and find it neither surprising nor simple. "He is genuinely happy," said Harriet. "I know. When did you last see him genuinely happy?" Julian looked at the window. "He was 17, he said, before our father died. After that he laughed more, not less, but it was different." Harriet was quiet. "He laughs at everything because it costs nothing," Julian continued. "This is different. He looks at her as though she is the solution to something he had stopped expecting to solve." "Yes," said Harriet softly, "he does." Julian said nothing for a moment. Then, "I owe you an additional acknowledgement." "Do you?" "You were right about Bramley. He is not impressed by titles, but is impressed by honesty, which you told me and which I only half believed. He told me yesterday that he thought I had managed it well." A pause. "He meant the assembly rooms, with Mrs. Hartwell." "He was watching that closely?" "He was watching everything that closely." Julian looked at her. "He also said his daughter was fond of you, that you had told her, when she first mentioned Freddie, that her own judgment was to be trusted before anyone else's." Harriet held his gaze. "She has good judgment. You didn't simply defer to rank." He paused. "Neither did I in the end, but it took me longer." "You got there," said Harriet. "Eventually." A dry pause. "With considerable direction. You were not especially easy to direct." "No, I rarely am." He said this without pride, simply as a fact. "I have been told it is my least appealing quality." "Who told you that?" "My mother, regularly, until she found it more amusing than frustrating." Something crossed his face, warm, private, gone quickly. "She would like you very much." The room was suddenly quieter than it had been. "Would she?" said Harriet. "She respects people who do not adjust themselves for the room." He looked at her steadily. "You are constitutionally incapable of adjusting yourself for the room." "I have been told it is a failing." "She would call it a virtue, as do I." A pause that was a fraction too long. "So do I." Harriet looked at her notebook, back at him. "You mentioned that you had been reading the draft chapters." "I have." "And?" He was quiet in the way he was quiet when actually thinking. "The chapter on marine invertebrates is the best piece of natural philosophy writing I have read by anyone. The argument is rigorous, the prose exact, the illustrations carry the weight they need to carry." He paused. "The chapter on coastal flora is not as strong. The argument loses its thread in the middle section." Harriet stared at him. "That is exactly the section I know is wrong." "Then fix it." "I've been trying to fix it for 6 weeks." "What's the problem?" "I cannot decide whether the argument is structurally weak or whether the evidence is insufficient, and I cannot fix the structure until I know which." He held out his hand. "Show me." She opened the notebook, found the chapter, slid it across the table. He read. She watched him, the way his eyes moved across the page, the small furrow between his brows at the middle section, the moment he turned back and reread something. "The evidence is sufficient," he said. "The structure is wrong. You've organized it chronologically when it should be organized by argument. The evidence for the second point is buried in the third section." Harriet looked at the page. He was right. She could see it immediately, the way she always could once someone named the thing she'd been circling. "I have been looking at this for 6 weeks, she said. "You were too close to it. So you read it for 6 minutes." "I read it fresh." He slid the notebook back. "You wrote the whole thing. It's different." She looked at the page, at the reordering that needed to happen, at the simplicity of it now that it was named. "Thank you," she said. "It is a very good book, Harriet." He had used her name, not testing it the way she had, simply naturally as though it had always been the word that fit. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression that was not composure, not irony, not any of the defaults, but something simply, plainly him, without the architecture around it. "I know," she said, which was not modest, and he looked at her as though the immodesty was the most correct thing she had ever said. They walked that afternoon, not planned, or rather planned in the way things were planned when two people arrived at the same idea independently and pretended they hadn't. Julian had a matter to attend to near the minster. Harriet had a specimen she wanted to examine in the wall near the south transept. York in late October at dusk was amber and grey and cold enough that breath showed. Harriet had her coat buttoned and her notebook tucked firmly under her arm. She had learned by now to carry it close rather than loose. The minster rose above them, too large and too old to be dramatic about, which she had always found comforting. "The coastal flora chapter," she said. "You've already reordered it in your head." "Twice. The Edinburgh publisher wants the manuscript by the 1st of December. You'll have it done." "You don't know that." "I've read what you write when you're not looking at it for 6 weeks. The pace is different. You write the first time as though you know exactly what you're saying. It's when you look too long that it goes wrong. Most people would encourage me to be careful. Most people want you to be careful so that they don't have to be uncomfortable with the result." He glanced at her. "The careful version is slower and worse." She looked at him. "You would make a very impatient editor." "I would make an excellent editor. I would tell you the truth, which is apparently harder to find than it should be." They had come around the south face of the minster. The stone was dark, with cold enormous pressing the last light down into the street. The cobbles were nearly empty. "When you leave York," said Harriet, carefully, not a question. "January, after Freddie's situation is settled. And then London." "And then London." A pause. "I am in the Lords in February. There are matters that require attention. There are always matters that require attention." "Yes," said Harriet. "I imagine there are." They walked. The minster rose beside them. The cold was specific and real. "The book," he said. "Will you send me a copy when it's published?" "I generally send copies to people who have been useful to the process." "Ah," a pause. "Am I in the acknowledgements?" "You are in the footnote, the stratigraphy notes on the oolite formation." "A footnote," he said gravely. "A footnote is more than most people get. I corrected your entire stratigraphy." "You did. The footnote is generous." She glanced at him. The ghost of something was on his face, the almost smile, hovering at the edge of being real. "You will be referred to as a landowner with local knowledge of the North Yorkshire strata, and nothing more, because the Edinburgh Philosophical Society has opinions about the appropriate sources for natural history publications, and those opinions do not include dukes." "I would be offended," he said, "if that were not entirely logical." They stopped. They had come to the corner where the minster walk turned south, the amber lamplight catching pale stone and his blonde hair and the dark of his eyes. Harriet thought, briefly, clearly, that there was no version of this evening in which she had not known it was coming. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Harriet," he said. "Yes," she said, not an answer to a question he had asked. He kissed her. Not tentatively. Julian Mercer did not do anything tentatively, but with the specific, considered certainty of a man who had decided something and was not reconsidering it. His hand came to her jaw, tilting her face up, and she kissed him back with the same deliberateness, the same clarity. No performance in it, nothing withheld. The minster stood above them, entirely unmoved, as it had stood through 700 years of human decisions it declined to comment on. They broke apart. The cold air was sharp between them. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke. The moment had its own weight. She became aware gradually that her notebook was still tucked under her arm, pressed between them, somewhat undignified, entirely real. She looked down at it, then at him. "The footnote," she said, "may need to be slightly longer." Julian looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed, fully, genuinely, the laugh of a man caught entirely off guard, and it was the best sound she had heard in York, possibly anywhere. They walked back as the last light went. Neither of them said anything that mattered. Everything had already been said. That evening, Harriet opened the notebook to page 12. The profile sketch was there. Blonde, sideways, 2 lines for the eyes. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to a fresh page and sketched it again, properly this time, with attention. The angle of his jaw, the way his expression settled when he was not performing anything for anyone. Dark eyes, even in pencil. She signed it with her initials in the bottom right corner, the way she signed the scientific plates. Then she went to bed and slept immediately and well, which surprised her. The letter from London arrived on a Monday, 3 days after the minster. Julian showed it to her on Tuesday. not in itself unusual, except that he was not, she had gathered, in the habit of showing anyone his correspondence. He put it on the table between them without preamble. It was from his aunt, Lady Mary Ann Mercer, formidable, well-connected, with opinions on the Aldwick dukedom she expressed as facts. The letter was elegant. Between its elegant lines, it was a set of instructions. Lady Mary Ann was coming to York. She had heard about Freddie, and had heard also various other things about Julian's time in York, which phrase she deployed once and did not elaborate on. She brought with her, the letter mentioned in its final paragraph, her goddaughter, Miss Edith Forsyth, who would be grateful for the society. Harriet read the final paragraph twice, set the letter down. "Miss Forsyth," she said, 23, excellent family, considerable fortune. He said this with the flat tone of a man reading from a document. My aunt has mentioned her approximately 8 times in the last 2 years. I see. I want you to understand that I did not invite my aunt to York. I know you didn't. Julian, she looked at him. I understand what the letter is. He was quiet for a moment. Do you understand that it is irrelevant? She held his gaze. I understand that you find it irrelevant. Is there a distinction? Your aunt is not a woman who accepts irrelevance gracefully. No, she is not. He paused. She is also not a woman who accepts being managed gracefully. The approach I intend is direct. What approach is that? The same one that has worked in York, he said. Honesty about everything. Outside, October had hardened into pre-November. The light was clean and flat. My father, said Harriet, is going to receive a call from Mr. Alford this week, a formal one. Julian's expression didn't change. Something under it did. He is making an offer. I believe so. My father will receive it with courtesy. He is obliged to. He will not pressure me, but he will tell me and ask me to consider. And will you consider it? For approximately as long as it takes to understand that I am not going to accept it. Julian was very still. And if I said, he said quietly, that I needed to hear that from you before my aunt arrived, you have heard it. Something in his face settled. The release of something held too tight. He nodded once. When my aunt arrives, he said, it will not be comfortable. She is effective. I grew up in York. I have managed effective women my entire life. Not like Mary Ann. Probably not exactly like Mary Ann, but the mechanism is the same. She will try to define me by what I am not, very pleasantly. She met his eyes. I have been not quite enough for everyone who has looked at this situation since October. I find I have stopped minding. Julian looked at her for a long moment. You are, he said, without competition, the most sufficient person I have ever met. That is a strange thing to say. It is not a compliment, it is a fact. He picked up his hat. I do not give compliments. I know, said Harriet. It is among your least appealing qualities. He looked at her, the almost smile again, closer than it had ever been. Then he left. Lady Mary Ann Mercer arrived on Friday. She was 60, silver-haired, dressed with the authority of a woman who considered fashion a dialect. She spoke fluently, but took no orders from. She was handsome in the manner of people who had always been handsome, and organized their life around it, without becoming dependent on it. Her eyes were the same dark shade as Julian's. They worked differently. She called on Harriet's family on Saturday morning, fast before York society could introduce them on its own terms. Harriet's mother received her warmly. Her father was pleasant and alert. Louisa was transparent in her fascination. Harriet offered tea and waited. Lady Mary Ann was skilled. She asked about York with genuine interest. She asked about Harriet's work with a precision that suggested prior inquiry, the publisher, the subject, the Edinburgh Philosophical Society's view of women in natural philosophy. She was not dismissive. Dismissiveness was not her instrument. Her instrument was the gentle, surgical introduction of context. My nephew speaks of your work with great admiration, she said. He is not a man who admires easily. No, said Harriet, he is not. He has been rather more engaged in York than I had anticipated. She looked at Harriet with those dark eyes. Julian came here to manage Freddie's situation. He has managed it, with your considerable assistance, rather differently than I expected. The situation was more complex than a simple management would accommodate. Yes, so he tells me. Lady Mary Ann set down her teacup. Miss Croft, I will be direct because I believe you prefer it. I do. Julian is the Duke of Aldwick. His choices carry weight beyond his own life. I am not here to be his obstacle. I am here because I love him, and I need to understand what he is considering. She looked at Harriet without performance. What I see is a young woman of good family, genuine intelligence and complete indifference to rank. These are not, in themselves, obstacles. The obstacle is that Julian does nothing halfway. If he has decided something, he has decided it all the way through, and I need to know what he has decided is built on something real. The room was quiet. "Lady Mary Ann," said Harriet, "I am writing a book on natural history that my Edinburgh publisher believes will be the best of its kind published by a woman in 20 years. I have no interest in performing any version of myself that is not the real one. I have no patience for being managed, and I have told your nephew so directly and repeatedly, and he has found it, against what I suspect were his initial expectations, acceptable." She paused. "I cannot tell you what he has decided. I can tell you only what I know to be true." "And what is that?" "That when I am with him," said Harriet steadily, "I am entirely myself, and so is he. And I think for Julian that is not a small thing." Lady Mary Ann looked at her for a long moment. Then, "No," she said, "it is not." She lifted her teacup. "Tell me about the book." London, meanwhile, had opinions. They arrived not by letter, but by inference, in the careful way that certain York acquaintances began phrasing their inquiries, in the columns of the London papers that reached the subscription library a week behind. In a note from Julian's solicitor in the 3rd week of November that he did not show Harriet, but whose contents she deduced from the specific quality of his expression when he came to her father's house the morning after receiving it. "London has noticed," she said. "London has always noticed. It has simply begun to say so." He sat in the upright chair. "There is a paragraph in last Thursday's Morning Post. It does not name you directly. It names the Duke of Aldwick and his prolonged stay in York, and speculates, with great delicacy, about the nature of his interest there." "In what terms?" "In the terms usually reserved for situations the writer finds improbable." He looked at her steadily. "A duke, a naturalist's daughter, York. The writer considers it a charming eccentricity." "That is not the worst thing they might have written." "No, it will get worse." He paused. "My aunt has family in 3 of the right drawing rooms. She is managing it." Harriet looked at him. "And you? How are you managing it?" "With complete indifference," he said, "which is apparently making it worse because they expected me to be embarrassed, and I am not." "Are you not?" He looked at her directly. "I am not remotely embarrassed. I am—" He stopped. "I find I do not have the correct vocabulary for what I am, which is itself new. You have excellent vocabulary." "Not for this." She said nothing for a moment. Outside, York carried on in its November grey. "Your aunt," she said, "what does she make of it, the London attention?" "She says it will settle once there is a formal development to report." A pause. "She is, in her way, encouraging it." "The formal development." "Yes." They looked at each other. "My father," said Harriet, "would need to be spoken to first before any formal development. He has just received Mr. Alford's application and declined it on my behalf, at my request, and he deserves to understand what he has declined it in favour of before anyone else makes assumptions." Julian was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, he does." Another pause. "Would tomorrow morning be too soon?" Harriet looked at him. "He rises at 7:30, she said. "He will be in his study by 8. "Then I will be here at 8, said Julian Mercer, and for once in their acquaintance said exactly what he meant without qualification. He was there at 8:05. Her father received him alone in the study for 45 minutes. Harriet sat in the sitting room and did not listen through the wall, or rather, she sat in the sitting room and listened through the wall and heard nothing useful, because Julian Mercer, conducting a serious conversation, dropped his voice to a register that old Plaster defeated entirely. When her father opened the study door and called for her, his expression was the one she knew as careful parental composure over a more complicated feeling. Julian was standing by the window. He turned when she came in. "Your father has been generous enough," he said, "to hear me out, and to give me his conditional approval, the conditions of which he will explain to you more fully." He paused. "I wanted you to hear what I said to him, so there is no confusion between what I have promised and what you were told I promised." Her father sat down behind the desk, which was his way of being discreet. Harriet stood in the middle of the room. "I told him," Julian said, "that I wished to ask his permission to pay my addresses to you with a view to marriage, should you be willing. I told him that I was aware of the considerable differences in our respective positions, and that I did not believe those differences constituted an obstacle, but that he was entitled to hold a different view, and I would hear it without resentment." He paused. He raised 3 things. The first was London. He has seen the Morning Post. The second was your work, which he asked me to speak to specifically. The third was your character, by which he meant whether I fully understood what I was undertaking. And what did you say? Harriet asked. To London I said that I had handled greater opposition, and that his daughter's reputation, once she was the Duchess of Aldwick, would be managed by the weight of that title, whether she wished it to be or not, which I acknowledged was its own complication. A pause. To your work I said that it was not a thing I would tolerate. I said precisely that word because I did not want any ambiguity. It was not something I would tolerate. It was something I would actively support, because a woman who could correct her own publisher's understanding of stratigraphy was not a woman to be diminished by a marriage, and that if he had any concern on that score, he should raise it with me directly, and I would answer it. He looked at her. To your character, I said that I had spent 6 weeks arguing with you and had not once won, which I took as sufficient evidence that I understood what I was undertaking. Her father made the sound again, the one that was not quite a cough. Harriet looked at Julian for a long moment. That, she said, is the most accurate description of the last 6 weeks I have heard. I have been working on it. Since when? Since approximately the 3rd morning, I came to this house to speak to your father, and found I was not in fact here to speak to your father. The formal offer from Mr. Alford had already been declined. Her father had handled it that same morning, gently and without drama, and Alford had received it with the dignity of a man who had suspected the answer and conducted himself well regardless. Julian heard this at 9 o'clock and appeared at the Croft house at 5 past. Harriet let him in herself. She looked at his expression. He took it well, she said. I know, your father told me. He came in, he did not sit down. Harriet. Yes. I have been managing what I feel about this, with the same method I apply to everything, proceeding in sequence, handling one situation before moving to the next. He paused. I am not good at not having a plan. I know. I am finding that the plan is not the point. What is the point? You, he said, plainly and without qualification. The sitting room was very quiet. There is your aunt, said Harriet. There is London. My aunt is managing. London will manage. I find I am profoundly indifferent to the timeline everyone else has set for this. He crossed the room, 2 steps, and stood close enough that she could see clearly the expression on his face, which was not composed and not ironic, and none of the things she had catalogued. It was simply open. I have made decisions in my life based on what was required and what was appropriate. I would like, for once, to make one based on what is actual. That is very sincere, said Harriet. For you. I am sincerely hoping you will say something encouraging. She put her notebook on the table, page 12 face up, the profile sketch between them. I declined Mr. Alford's offer because he would not have read my stratigraphy and told me it was wrong, because he would have admired my work from a careful, shrinking distance and called that support. She looked up at Julian. I declined it because I have spent 6 weeks in the company of someone who argues with me as an equal, and I find it is the only arrangement I can tolerate. Julian looked at the sketch, then at her. That is me, he said. It is a reasonable likeness. When did you? 3 weeks ago. My hand was moving without my permission. It happens when I'm not attending. He looked at it for another moment. May I keep it? No, said Harriet, but you may stay for tea and I will draw you a better one and you may keep that. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the open one, the laugh's quieter cousin, warmth, specific and real, directed entirely at her. Yes, he said, all right. She put the kettle on. He sat in the upright chair and watched her, and did not pretend otherwise. She did not pretend she hadn't noticed. It was, she thought, the most comfortable she had ever felt in her own sitting-room. Lady Mary Ann Mercer lasted 2 more weeks in York before she arrived at the Croft house uninvited on a Thursday morning, accepted tea from Harriet's mother, spoke for 40 minutes with Harriet's father about the geological heritage of the North Riding, and declared on the way out that Harriet was formidably sensible, and that Julian had, for once in his adult life, shown reasonable judgment. Julian heard this from Harriet, with every indication of satisfaction she rarely displayed. She said, formidably sensible, he said, those exact words. That is the highest praise she has ever given anyone outside the family. I am aware that I have been assessed. How do you feel about that? I passed, said Harriet. How do you feel? He looked at her with those dark eyes. Relieved, he said, and slightly outmatched, which is, I find, becoming my natural condition. Miss Forsyth departed York with apparent cheerfulness and a new interest in natural history, which Harriet took as a compliment, and Julian took as his aunt's last word on the subject, which was probably also what it was. Freddie proposed again before December. Properly this time. Formal application to Bramley, formal letter to Julian, full procedural dignity. He had spent 3 weeks composing the letter to Julian. It arrived at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, because Freddie had been awake since 4. Julian read it at breakfast, read it twice, set it down and looked at the fire. Then he wrote back, "Yes, obviously, stop sending letters at 6 in the morning to die." He showed Harriet the exchange over tea. She read both letters. When she looked up, her expression was doing something he hadn't seen before, simply moved, without the composure over it. "Obviously," she said. "It was obvious." "You didn't think so in October." "In October I was wrong about several things." He paused. "I have since been corrected." "By Freddie?" "By a woman with limestone dust on her coat who told me on the first day that dignity was not a negotiating position." He looked at her steadily. "You were right. From the beginning." Harriet looked at Freddie's letter, looping, earnest handwriting slightly too large for the page. "He is going to need guidance," she said. "Ongoing, significant amounts. Clara will provide most of it. She is considerably more sensible than he is. She is considerably more sensible than most people. Yes," a pause, "she will be a very good Mercer." "She will," said Harriet. And then, meeting his eyes, "The Mercers appear to have a type." Julian was quiet for one moment, then, "Harriet." "Yes." "I would like to ask you something." "You may." "Not here. Not in the sitting room with the upright chair and the stratigraphy notes." He stopped. Julian Mercer did not stop mid-sentence. "I want it to be right." Something warm moved through her ribs. "All right, when?" "This afternoon, the Minster walk, 4 o'clock." "The light is better in the afternoon," she said. He looked at her with full recognition, knowing she was quoting him back at him, knowing why. "Yes," he said, "it is." The Minster at 4 o'clock in late November was cold and specific, and very beautiful. The stone dark against the white sky, the last light amber along the high windows. They walked the south side as they had before. Her coat was buttoned. Her notebook was in her bag where it belonged. He was beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, as they had been almost touching on most of their walks in the last month, neither of them narrowing the distance and neither widening it. He stopped. She stopped. He turned to face her. "I am not," he said, "going to be a simple person to be married to. I know. I am going to be managed by London when I am in London, and bring those habits home, and you are going to find them intolerable. Almost certainly. I am going to interfere with your work. You are going to interfere with my work and occasionally be right about it, which is the more irritating version." "Yes," a pause. "I cannot promise to be easy." "Julian," said Harriet, "I collect fossils from walls before breakfast. I argue as a primary mode of conversation. I am not looking for easy." She looked at him directly. "I am looking for someone who argues back." He looked at her for a moment. "There is one condition," she said. "Name it." "The work continues. After always, the next book and the one after that. The Edinburgh correspondence, the specimen collecting, the field work. It is not a hobby, I will be gently permitted. It is what I am." He held her gaze. "I have a footnote in a natural history publication about the oolite limestone formations of North Yorkshire," he said. "I am very proud of it. I would not have it removed for anything." Her mouth curved. "It does not name you." "It does not need to." He stepped closer, close enough that the cold air was no longer cold. "Harriet, will you marry me?" Not entirely a question. More the way he said her name, specific, decided, as though the word had been arriving at this for some time. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. She kissed him back. Above them the Minster stood, vast and unimpressed, entirely familiar with human decisions made at its foot, declining to comment, as it always had. When they broke apart she was smiling, which was not an expression she wore habitually, and which he appeared to find remarkable. "What?" she said. "Nothing. Only that you don't smile enough, and when you do it is very much worth waiting for." "That," said Harriet, "is an actual compliment. Don't tell anyone." He offered her his arm. "I have a reputation." She took it. "A footnote's worth of reputation," she said. "Generous, as I said." They walked back through York as the last of the November light gave out, and Harriet thought that the city looked not different, but more clearly itself, all its Roman bones and medieval skin and Georgian surface layered over each other, evidence everywhere if you knew where to look. She knew where to look. The wedding was in January at the Minster, because where else would Harriet Croft be married? The Minster, which had presided over 700 years of human ceremony without being impressed by any of it, was not impressed by this one either, but it was very beautiful. The stone was cold, the windows grey-white, and Louisa cried before the service began, which set off their mother, which set off Clara Bramley, there as Harriet's attendant, by this point practically a Croft herself. Freddie cried during the vows openly and without embarrassment, and then denied it afterwards so consistently that it became a Mercer family legend. Lady Mary Ann did not cry. She sat in the front pew and looked at her nephew and the woman beside him, and said afterwards only that Julian's expression during the ceremony had been one she had never seen on his face before, which she declined to elaborate on, which was the most eloquent thing she said all day. Julian's expression during the ceremony was the one Harriet had first seen outside the minster in October, not composed, not performing, simply present. He said his vows the way he said her name, quietly, specifically, as though the words were precise, and he had verified them before using them. She said hers the same way. It was, all things considered, an extremely satisfactory ceremony. The minster had nothing to add. The book came out in the February following the wedding. The Edinburgh Philosophical Society called it the most rigorous contribution to natural history published by a woman in a generation. The London papers noted the elegance of the prose alongside the precision of the argument, and asked in a manner both complimentary and bewildered how Miss Croft, now the Duchess of Aldwick, we are informed, had managed both. Harriet read this in her study at the London house, and found it satisfying in the way that being right for a long time, before being acknowledged, is satisfying. Julian read it over her shoulder. The footnote is on page 47. I know where it is. It doesn't name me. It never names you. I remain very proud of it. She looked up at him. He was 30 and still blonde and still dark-eyed, and still constitutionally incapable of being impressed by most things, which she found, some years into their marriage, as appealing as she had at their first collision on Stonegate. You are mentioned, she said, in the acknowledgements. He stilled. I am not. You are, third line. She opened the front matter. Third line and to J, without whom the limestone would have remained carboniferous. He read it twice. J, he said. I didn't want it to be obvious. To anyone who has read the footnote it is entirely obvious. Then the right people will know. He looked at her for a moment, the same look, the one without the architecture, and then did what he did so rarely that she had long ago made it her private measure of what mattered. He smiled fully at her. The right people, he said, are the only ones who count. Freddie and Clara married that spring. The ceremony was brief and bright, and Freddie laughed through the vows, and Clara, who knew exactly which things mattered to him and which didn't, laughed with him. Julian gave a speech at the wedding breakfast that was dry and perfectly worded, and entirely unable to conceal that he was proud of his brother. Freddie understood this and did not remark on it, because Freddie had in the end more grace than people gave him credit for. He and Clara settled at the Aldwick estate in Yorkshire. The limestone there, as Julian had told Harriet long before, was oolite throughout. Harriet visited in August to examine it. The second book came out 3 years after the first, the third 2 years after that. They were better each time, sharper, wider, more certain, the way things got when done by someone who had arranged her life to allow the doing of them. The Aldwick London house had a study that was Harriet's in the way her sitting room in York had been Harriet's. Notebooks and specimens, and light from the west window in the afternoon. Julian had the study above. They shouted through the ceiling when something was urgent, descended when it wasn't. Their housekeeper described this to guests as His Grace, and Her Grace have a system, which was accurate. Julian remained, in all the ways that mattered, not a simple person. He brought London habits home, and Harriet found them intolerable in the proportions he had predicted. He interfered with her work, and was occasionally right about it, which remained the more irritating version. He attended 2 meetings of the Edinburgh Philosophical Society in the years following the first book, and introduced himself each time as a landowner with local knowledge of the North Yorkshire strata, which was what the footnote said, and which he found privately hilarious each time. The children arrived in the order that children did, when 2 people were fully occupied with other things, and kept being cheerfully ambushed by the domestic consequences. The first was a girl. Eleanor, Harriet named her. Julian accepted immediately. Eleanor was born in autumn, and from her first weeks showed a strong interest in examining things closely, and a comprehensive lack of interest in being redirected. She is exactly like you, said Julian, the first time Eleanor got hold of a specimen and refused to release it. She is sensible, said Harriet. She has your eyes. They are going to make every person she meets feel slightly assessed. That is your quality. You're doing it now. I have been doing it since October 1813, said Harriet, and you have not left. He did not answer this, because the answer was visible to anyone who looked, and Julian Mercer was not, despite the long habit of the opposite, difficult to read when he didn't bother to be. The second child was a boy, Robert for Harriet's father, who cried when told and then composed himself and said he was very pleased in the tone of a man overwhelmed and managing it with dignity. Robert Mercer grew up to be cheerful in the way Freddie was cheerful, laughing too easily, meaning it entirely. The third arrived 2 years after that, Cecily, bright and loud, who at age 3 discovered her mother's specimen collection and at age 4 helpfully reorganized it by colour rather than genus. Harriet described this to Edinburgh as a significant setback. Julian described it as evidence that Cecily would be a problem in the best possible way. She is exactly like Freddie, he said. She is entirely her own person, said Harriet. We will manage. We always manage, said Julian, and looked at her with the expression that was not the formal one or the composed one or any of the ones he showed London, and Harriet thought, as she had thought in varying versions since a Tuesday morning on Stonegate with limestone on her coat, that he was exactly as interesting as she had not at first expected. The fourth was a boy, James, nobody's particular name, which suited him, because James Mercer turned out to be the quietest of the four, watching, attentive, slow to speak, and precise when he did. Some years on, old enough to read, young enough to still be impressed by things, he informed his father at breakfast that the garden wall was limestone. Julian looked at Harriet across the table with an expression of helpless recognition. She said, "Tell him." "Keartsulite," said Julian to his son. "The same series as the estate in Yorkshire. Your mother wrote about it." James considered this. "Which book?" "The first one, page 47, footnote." James found the book. He was back in 8 minutes. He read the footnote in the doorway. "It doesn't say who J is," he said. "No," said Harriet. "Who is J?" Julian looked at his wife. Harriet looked at her husband. A private thing passed between them, the kind that had no name because it had been accumulating for years and had long passed the point of needing one. "Your father," said Harriet. James considered this. "He's not a naturalist." "No," said Julian. "I am a landowner with local knowledge of the North Yorkshire strata. The footnote says that." "The footnote is accurate." James looked at the book, at his father, at his mother, at the book again. Then he nodded, satisfied, and put it back on the shelf with the care of a child who understands that certain things matter even before he can say exactly why. That night, after 4 children were asleep and the house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet, when those 4 children were the reason, a different and more valuable quiet than before, and Harriet had learned to distinguish them, she sat in the west study with her notebook and the lamp and the manuscript for the 4th book. Julian came in at 10 without knocking, which he had stopped doing several years into the marriage on the grounds that it was his house too, and that she was always going to tell him to come in anyway. He sat in the chair across from her, the good leather one, his father's, brought from the estate because he liked it. The upright chair was in storage in York, retired with honour. "James has organised the specimen trays by stratum," he said. Harriet looked up, at his age. "I told him about the oolite sequence this morning. He understood it immediately." "Of course he did." Julian was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the desk and the lamp and the 4th book's scattered pages. "You have," he said, "changed everything about how I spend my time." "Yes," said Harriet, "I know." "And you consider that an improvement?" "Considerable." She looked at him. "Do you?" He got up from the chair and came around the desk and took the notebook from her hands and opened it to the first page. On the first page, she had put it there in the first week of this notebook 6 months ago, was a sketch. 4 small faces, quick and specific, Eleanor's serious eyes, Robert's grin, Cecily's expression of impending chaos, James's watchful stillness, and beside them, very small, 2 more, hers and his. He looked at it for a moment. "The footnote," he said, "should have named me." The footnote was exactly right. "J could be anyone." "It is not anyone." She looked up at him. "The right people know." He looked at her. The lamplight was warm. Outside, London was being London, enormous, indifferent, entirely unaware of the specific and complete arrangement in this room, which was correct because it was not London's business. "Harriet," he said. "Yes," she said, not an answer to a question. "The same as always." He kissed her. She kissed him back. The notebook was still in his hand, open to the first page, 6 small faces in the lamplight. Above them, 4 children slept. The limestone in the garden wall was oolite, as it had always been, as it would be long after all of this. Evidence of time, patient and specific, waiting for someone who knew how to look. She knew where to look.